This is part 3 of 4 on Chapter 7, looking at nutrition, ecology, and growth for microorganisms. So far we've looked at microbial nutrition in the first part. The second part was all about membrane transport, the different types. So in this one we're going to be looking at different environmental factors that can influence microorganism growth. So environmental factors that can influence microbes. All microbes live in what's called a niche or a niche, and that is the total adaptations organisms make to their habitat. So habitat is the actual physical location where these organisms live, and then the niche includes these organisms' job, their adaptations to that habitat, that location. So the environmental factors we're going to look at affect the function of metabolic enzymes. So this is why they're important. So remember, enzymes are responsible for helping to speed up all the chemical reactions inside of a cell. So having these enzymes working properly is really important for helping the organism to grow and to reproduce and to live. So these environmental factors that can influence metabolic enzymes and thus microorganism growth include temperature, oxygen requirements, the pH of the environment, osmotic pressure, and barometric pressure. And we're going to go through the list starting with the temperature. So for temperature, there's 3 cardinal temperatures for every microorganism. So there's a minimum temperature. This is the lowest temperature that permits the microbe's growth and metabolism. So think of it as like the coldest temperature at which you can function. There's a maximum temperature. This is the highest temperature that permits the microbe's growth and metabolism. So think of this as like the highest temperature that you can function at. And then we have that optimum temperature. And the optimum temperature that promotes the fastest rate of growth, the metabolism of that microorganism. So this is that temperature where like your body feels the best at. You can, you feel like you can do anything when you're at that temperature. So we have these temperatures, and they make a nice curve. So you have your minimum, you have your maximum, and then you have this optimum that's somewhere in the middle or in between the minimum and maximum. So these are examples of these curves up here. And organisms, they have adapted into, in your book, we have 3 different adaptation groups. So in the blue curve, that is the psychrophile. These are organisms that live at cold temperatures. And the temperature at the bottom is in degrees Celsius. So these organisms, they grow the best at 4 degrees Celsius. And 0 degrees Celsius is freezing. These organisms, they can function at pretty cold temperatures, so around -15. They can also function at a +15, so at a little bit warmer temperatures, but their maximum is around 4 or 5 degrees Celsius. So these organisms live in cold environments. We have the mesophiles. These are organisms that function best at 37 degrees Celsius. And remember, 37 degrees Celsius is human body temperature. So these organisms are organisms that grow at human body temperature, the best. They can survive in cold temperatures like 10 degrees Celsius. They can even survive up to 50 degrees Celsius. But their optimum is in that 35 to 40 degree range. And this is why most organisms are mesophiles. This is why we put our plates and anything we do in lab that we want to grow overnight, we put them in an incubator that's set at 37 degrees to get that optimum growth. Then we also have thermophiles, which is over here in the pink curve. Thermophiles, they love heat. So they're at about 70 degrees Celsius is their optimum. They can live at 45, 50. They can survive up to 80, but they prefer that 70 degree temperature. So we have these 3 kind of adaptation groups for the temperature. Besides temperature, which is really important, another requirement is gas. And usually we look at oxygen because most of our organisms, they do aerobic respiration or cellular respiration, so they either need oxygen or they can't use oxygen at all. So as oxygen is utilized during cellular respiration, some of it is transformed into toxic products. Just going through the chemical reactions, you get some toxic waste produced. So you can get singlet oxygens, superoxide ions, peroxide, and hydroxyl radicals. And these toxins can cause damage to that cell. So most cells, they've developed enzymes to neutralize these toxic products. So they have, for example, an enzyme called superoxide dismutase. That one takes care of the superoxide ion. It mutates it back to normal. There's also another enzyme called catalase. Catalase breaks down hydrogen peroxide into water and oxygen. So we have these enzymes that help to take care of these toxic products and protect the cell. Although there are some microorganisms that don't have these enzymes, they're not capable of breaking down those toxic products. So these organisms, they actually have adapted to live in oxygen-free environments. And I'll give you different terms to look at this oxygen requirement stuff. So sorry about the slide, it's a lot of terms, but I'll go through them. So categories for oxygen requirement. We have aerobes. These are organisms that utilize oxygen, and they have those enzymes we just talked about to detoxify those toxic products that are produced. So aerobes, they can use oxygen. They're pretty happy in it. Obligate aerobes. So obligate means that they have to be in that environment. So obligate anaerobes, they have to be in an environment with oxygen. They cannot grow without oxygen. This, I guess, would be like humans. We need oxygen in order to live, so we're kind of obligate aerobes. There's also facultative anaerobes. So facultative anaerobes, they utilize oxygen, but they don't really necessarily have to have it. They can still get along without it. So anaerobe means without oxygen, and facultative is like they need help, but not really. So those are the facultative anaerobes. Microaerophilics are organisms that only require a small amount of oxygen. So in just the air that you're breathing, it's about 21% oxygen. Microaerophilics, they can live in environments that have less oxygen. So like 10% or 5% oxygen. So less than the 21% we have in our air. Anaerobes are organisms that do not utilize oxygen, so they don't need it for growth or anything. Obligate anaerobes, these are the ones that they don't have those enzymes to detoxify those toxic chemicals that are produced during aerobic respiration. So obligate anaerobes, they cannot have oxygen in their environment. If there's any oxygen at all, that organism is going to die. It's not going to survive. So obligate again means they have to be in that environment. So they have to be in an anaerobe environment, so without oxygen. And then we also have aerotolerant anaerobes. These are organisms, they don't utilize oxygen, but if oxygen's there, they don't really care. They'll be fine. They'll survive and grow in its presence. So there's quite a few different terms. They're kind of confusing. You do need to know them. So flashcards would probably be the best way to learn these, or just quiz each other on them. You can culture different organisms based on their oxygen requirements, and this is really cool. It's called a thiotube, THIO. It has a special type of broth in it that oxygen can dissolve in. So in the tube on the right hand side, at the very top of the tube, it has the 20 to 21% oxygen that's just found in the normal atmosphere. These are where obligate aerobes will grow. So obligate aerobes, remember, are organisms that have to have oxygen. So if you put an obligate aerobe species into this tube, they're going to grow towards the top. And I'm going to kind of jump around. If you look at the real picture, the tube on the far left, that cloudy stuff is growth. So the tube on the far left, that's been inoculated with the obligate aerobe, so it's growing only at the top. And then as you go down in this theobroth, the oxygen gets less and less until you get to 0% at the bottom. So at the bottom, if you are growing an obligate anaerobe, these are organisms that have to be in an oxygen-free environment. They're going to grow at the bottom, and we don't have any examples over here. The microaerophiles are going to grow somewhere in the middle. You'd see like this little column of growth in the tube. And again, they grow at about 10 to 5% oxygen. And then the other things, they're going to show different growth patterns. So if something grows all the way throughout the tube, that means that they're one of those ones that they don't have to have oxygen available, but they can grow in its presence. So they're just going to grow everywhere because they don't really need it, but you know, they can break down the toxins if they have to. Besides oxygen, another gas that's really important is carbon dioxide. So all microorganisms, they require a little bit of carbon dioxide in their metabolism. There are organisms called capnophiles, where you have to put them in a special incubator because they grow their best when there's higher CO2 than what's normally present in the atmosphere. And you have to put them in a special incubator that's pumping in more CO2 for them to grow. So besides temperature and besides oxygen, another thing that can affect growth is the pH. And kind of like temperature, with pH we have three kind of groupings that we're going to look at. So the majority of the microorganisms grow between a pH of 6 and 8. And if you know anything about the pH scale, I can go over that quick. So the pH scale down at the bottom, it goes from 0 to 14. 7 is neutral. So right in the middle, that's a neutral pH. It's just plain water, plain distilled water. Anything with a pH less than 7, it's acidic. So this is like lemon juice, hydrochloric acid. Anything above a 7, that's a base or an alkaline environment. So milk of magnesia, lye, bleach is an alkaline solution. So if an organism grows between 6 and 8, they grow around that neutral pH, they're called neurophiles. If they grow less than 7, so like between like a 2 and a 4, and extremely acidic pHs, those are called acidophiles. So acid acidophile. And phile just means loving, so acid loving. If an organism grows in an alkaline or a basic solution, they're called alkalinophiles, so they're alkaline loving organisms. So again, basically just three kind of groups. So you have acidophiles, neutrophiles, or alkinophiles for that. So we have temperature, we have oxygen requirements, so the atmosphere, we have the pH. There's also osmotic pressure, so most microorganisms exist under hypotonic or isotonic solutions. So isotonic means that the amount of water in and inside the cell, outside the cell are the same. Hypotonic solution means that there's more water outside the cell compared to inside the cell. And most microorganisms have a cell wall, so they can survive in these hypotonic environments. And if you don't remember hypotonic and isotonic, just go to the previous section in this chapter to kind of review those. So some organisms are halophiles. This is where they require high concentration of salt in their environment. So these are organisms that are actually living in a hypertonic environment. So there's more water inside the cell compared to outside the cell because there's so much salt outside of the cell. But these halophiles, they require that because they've adapted to that habitat. We also have osmotolerant organisms, so they do not require that high concentration of the solute, like salt for example, but they can tolerate it when it occurs. So they have mechanisms to deal with the flow of the water and kind of balancing that out. So these are organisms that live in kind of extreme environments. They can deal with this really salty water. And then other environmental factors, so barophiles, these are really cool. So these are organisms that live under extreme pressure, so think of really deep sea vents where there's thousands of meters of water on top of them, so very, very high pressure. These organisms, if you capture them and bring them up to normal atmospheric pressure, so at sea level or above sea level, they're actually going to burst and die. So they're going to rupture if they're exposed to that normal pressure. Because they need all that pressure, they're so used to it, they've adapted to it.